All right, so exam 2 is going to be on chapters 6, 7, and 17. Again, you'll have 50 questions. You'll have 75 minutes to complete the exam. Um, so we will go ahead and get started. Did you guys do your study guide? All right, so we'll start with ethics. Um, Ethics is a system of standards or moral principles that direct actions, right, as being either right or wrong. It's concerned with the ways people, either individually or as a group, decide the following, right? What actions are right or wrong, if one ought to do something, if one has the right to do something, or one has the duty to do something, right? And so we, often too, we can put in there your morals and your values, which morals are concerned with dealing with right or wrong behavior, right, which is your conduct, as well as your character. Um, so when we look at personal versus professional ethics, I forgot to share my screen. When we look at personal versus professional ethics provide your guidelines, or sorry, personal ethics provide your personal guidelines for living, right? You ultimately get to choose what your personal code of ethics includes, and that is also going to influence your nursing ethics. So sometimes your personal ethics will conflict with the State Nurse Practice Act, right? So we have to think about what are some things that we find ethically correct, even moral, and how can sometimes that interfere or conflict with that State Nurse Practice Act. So some of the ethical responsibilities of nurses, advocacy. What does it mean to be an advocate?
To stand up and speak out for something or someone.
Okay, so to stand up or speak out for somebody. Exactly. So when we think about our clients or our patients, right, a lot of times they are in vulnerable positions, right? They're ill, they're, going through a trauma, something is going on with them. Sorry, I'm gonna fix my camera. Um, And so our job is to advocate for what is best for our patients, right? Knowledge is power. The more knowledge, the more understanding that they have, the better they are to make important decisions regarding their care. And when they are in those vulnerable positions, it's our job to protect them, right? What does it mean to be accountable?
To be reliable.
To yeah, to take sorry, my I said something, but I realized now that my mic was not on when I said it. So I just mouthed it to you guys. I meant to say taking accountability is like being responsible for your actions, owning up to what you did.
Right. Hi, Pauline. Do you want to turn your camera on? So the word accountable means that you are answerable to yourself, right? But we're not just, it's not just ourselves, it's our clients, our patients, those that we're working with, those that we work for. So we generally, as nurses, are held to a much higher standard, right? Just because of the jobs that we perform. When we look at client safety reporting, so colleague reporting, what are some things that we would have to report our colleagues for?
Taking meds.
Okay, taking meds.
Any type of negligence, patient negligence.
Okay, any type of patient negligence, if they come to work and they are impaired, right? Oh, okay. So, sorry. So what is our responsibility in that, right? That goes back to almost like your advocacy, right? It's about protecting our clients or protecting our patients. It's being held accountable. And so if you have a coworker or even a supervisor, then your job that you feel is impaired, your job is to report that, so that they cannot take care of patients, and potentially cause harm. When we look at system-based issues, is identifying, issues, whether it's a new procedure, or even new equipment that maybe hasn't, been, or you haven't been given appropriate education and training on how to use the equipment or what the new procedure is. Um, and so, again, this is again sticking up for yourself. If you don't know how to do a procedure or you don't know how to use specific equipment, it is notifying those that are above you so that you can get the education and the training you need to ensure that you are using the equipment and following the procedure appropriately. And then we have our ethical principles. And so I know everybody has heard these before now, but non-maleficence, your beneficence, autonomy, fidelity, and justice. What is non-maleficence? Give me what would be an example of non-maleficence?
I think of it like if a patient was being combative, you wouldn't want to hit them back, so do no harm to them.
Very good. Um, And so, again, sometimes that's often an instinct, right? Is to strike back when somebody hits you. But yeah, so do no harm. Making sure you're following the rights of medication administration. Um, providing for safety for your clients, right? Bed rails up, bed in the lowest position, right? Call bell within reach. Um, all of those things are all, part of that do no harm. And so then that brings us to beneficence, which is do good. So what would be a good example of, or, when we look at beneficence, there's things that we have to do that are normally part of a nurse's job. So what would be an example of beneficence? And this one's a little bit harder, right? So we're doing good, right? That's the goal is. And, when we're taking care of clients, we're taking care of our patients, right? We're putting our clients' needs first, right? So it's kind of the same thing. If or not kind of the same thing, it's very similar to non-maleficence, right? It's, making sure that you do proper shift change, right? That you do your S-bar and provide that, that turnover from you to the next shift. If you make a mistake, it is making sure that you report the mistake, right? So that proper procedures can be followed so that it doesn't cause harm to our patients. Um, and so, there's clients, our clients are going to be above the their needs are more important than ours. Their needs are more important than the organization. And so it's just making sure that we are doing everything we can to provide that care for our patients. What is autonomy?
Patient's right to choose.
Okay, the patients have the right to choose. That's their freedom of choice. It also includes their privacy, right? And so they have the right to determine the course of action for whatever, for treatments, um, And so it's, you know, the ability for them to think through all the facts based on what was provided to them and then decide what their treatment choice are. You know, making sure that it's a decision that they made voluntarily without coercion from anybody else. And so what are some things that we can do as nurses to encourage patients' autonomy?
If they're wavering or unsure, maybe like direct that uncertainty back to them and ask, how they feel about the situation in question or the
Okay.
decision they're trying to make.
Okay. And then make sure that they have all the necessary information, right, in order to make that good decision for them, right? And then what is justice? Justice is fair to all, right? And so it's fair and equal treatment to all of our clients, regardless, like, you know, avoiding any bias that we may have. And so what you do for one, you should do for another, right? That is an example, you know, that's what justice is all about. So talk to, so again, more on autonomy, thinking through all the facts, deciding on the basis of an independent thinking system process, acting based on that personal decision, and then making sure that they're making that decision voluntarily, right, without pressure. So one thing that when we look at, you know, trying to encourage our patients to be autonomous, there's this, it's called beneficent paternalism. And it is a disrespectful attitude toward the client and what the client has to contribute to their care as well as their recovery. So it's more like, I know what's best for you type of attitude. And so this generally is, again, it's a disrespectful attitude. It is something that we should avoid when working with our clients. However, in certain situations, beneficent paternalism is effective, and that's usually in emergent situations where like obtaining a court order to save the life of a child against parents' wishes, right? So if the parent decides that, you know, or makes the decision that they're not going to allow their child to get a life-saving treatment, right, then we can use that beneficent paternalism to go and get an emergency court order so that the child can receive the life-saving treatment. So when we get into some of the legal aspects of healthcare or nursing, this was chapter 7. The state statutes that apply to licensed persons and the situations in client care that could result in legal action. So this is, you know, when we look at this, these are the legal aspects of the standard of care nursing, right? So if you had questions about, you know, what you can do, what you can't do, these are the things, these are some resources for you. So the organization rules and regulations, your obligations under the law, your professional groups like NAPNEs, and then of course your wonderful Nurse Practice Act. So your Nurse Practice Act, right? That's that overarching document that says this is what you can and cannot do within the state that you practice in, right? Um, and so, sorry, there's more people coming. So that's going to give that overarching, can you guys turn your cameras on? That's going to give you the overarching, this is what you can do. Your organization, rules and regulations, your policies and procedures of that organization, they cannot go above the Nurse Practice Act, right? But they can limit practice. So it's super important, not only do you know what your Nurse Practice Act says, but you also want to know what the policy and procedures are within your organization that kind of define your scope of practice within that organization. The minimal competencies, again, to report to practice safety. That's again your Nurse Practice Act. Has anybody looked at their Nurse Practice Act to kind of see what it says for their state of practice? No, you're waiting until you get it. Once you
Looked
get
at a
booked there.
little bit.
So it's really important. Again, the Nurse Practice Act, is, here it is. It's each state, general provisions, right? The general fees that are involved with licensure, the licensure process, what is considered unprofessional conduct. It also, information related to reasons for suspended or revoking a license. And then most states also have an impaired professional program. So that's, if you're at work and you have to report a fellow nurse or supervisor for, diverting medications, being impaired at work. A lot of states have those impaired professional programs so that they can potentially go through the program and then reapply for licensure. But it's a pretty stringent program. The responsibilities of the Nurse Practice Act, again, it's going to give you the general functions of the licensed nurse, whether it's a LPN, LVN, RN, advanced practice nurse, nurse practitioner. It'll also define nursing. So the specific definitions for each one of those nurses, LPNs, LVNs, RNs, as well as the standards of nursing conduct. Also, organization approval, administration of nursing programs, right? So all nursing programs provide nursing education within the state need to be approved by that state board of nursing. And it also tells you how much continuing education that you will need to have for licensure renewal. So that is something very important to know. Obviously, when you apply initially for your license, your schooling, right, would count. But then as you go to renew, there are going to be a certain amount of contact hours or continuing education hours that you must do in order to renew your license. And it's different for each state. So that's why, again, looking at that Nurse Practice Act is super important. Functions of the State Board of Nursing, licensing and certifying. Specialty certifications are from related associations, right? So if you decide to go get your IV certification or your long-term care certification or your wound and ostomy certification, that's going to be through those specific associations rather than your State Board of Nursing. They also set the fees. How much does it cost to renew your license, your initial license? It establishes the standards for educational programs. So if you have ever wondered why you have to take the courses that you have to take and do the clinical hours that you have to do throughout your programs, that is established through the State Board of Nursing. It also, again, approves the nursing schools. It also determines the duration and the renewal of license. Do you have to renew every year or is it every 2 years? It also maintains your inactive status list. So maybe if you decide that you're done with nursing and you don't, you want to put your nursing license in an inactive status, you can do that. It also carries out disciplinary actions for violators. And this could be you didn't do your continuing education, you were impaired at work, you diverted medications, any type of felony outside of work can also affect your nursing license. So the State Board of Nursing would carry out that disciplinary action as well. They develop the programs for the impaired nurses. They also suspend and revoke licenses, and deal with the appeal process. So categories that can result in disciplinary actions. So fraud and deceit, criminal activity, negligence, any violation of that Nurse Practice Act, discipline by another jurisdiction. So when you do get your license, you can either apply for a state license or you can apply for the compact license, which allows you to practice in other states. They are all linked through nurses. So if you were practicing in another state and went in front of the Board of Nursing, that is reported back to your home Board of Nursing. And then we have incompetence or unethical conduct, and of course, alcohol or drug abuse. So what are some examples of unethical conduct?
Stealing patient's medication.
Okay, stealing patient medication. It could be a HIPAA breach, right? So you breached confidentiality, refusal to provide care for patients, failure to maintain competence in practice is also considered an unethical conduct. Incompetence is just failing to meet accepted standards of nursing practice. What would be an example of negligence?
Leaving the side rail down.
Okay, leaving the side rail down, right? It's something that can cause serious risk to the health, safety, physical or mental health of a client. All right, so what happens if I do something wrong? So first thing is the complaint is sent to the State Board of Nursing. These, State Board of Nursing is going to review the complaint. They will verify it, if and in which state the nurse is licensed. They will verify whether the act is regulated by the Nurse Practice Act. Is it practice related? And then they will verify if there is a positive criminal background check, and then they're going to do their investigation. And during the investigation, they will conduct interviews and gather evidence. And then board proceedings. This is where during the board proceeding, this is where the nurse has the, opportunity to respond to the allegations. And there's a couple things that can happen. They can do a settlement conference. They can do a formal administrative hearing. And there are some alternatives to discipline programs. And so that would be like your substance abuse monitoring program. And some of the board actions, they could do emergency action. So like an immediate suspension to protect the public, pending a complete investigation. They can do disciplinary actions, which could be either a fine or a civil penalty, a reprimand. They can limit practice, they can suspend, revoke. They can, also, tell you that you need to do remediation or even educational courses, or monitoring. So, for example, I had a nurse that worked for me a long time ago, who was caught diverting medications. So for a period of I think it was a year, she couldn't administer any narcotics. So if she was on shift, another nurse would have to administer narcotics for her. So they can put limitations on your practice. Then reporting and enforcement. So Nurses, I said earlier, Nurses is a national database for verifying licenses and discipline actions for nurses. So the information when you look on the Board of Nursing website, when you look up your, when you get your license, is anybody a CNA currently? So have you ever looked at the Board of Nursing to look at your license? Or okay. So it gives your name, your license number, the issue date of your license, the expiration date, and your state of practice, right? Doesn't give any personal information like your phone number, your age, your home address, those types of things are not going to be on there. But your nursing license or any license through the Board of Nursing is a matter of public record, so your information will be there. And then it is also put into Nurses, so that it's just a national database. So especially with those compact licenses where you can work in different states, it's just an easier way for us to verify licenses. There's also a national provider database that is available as well. All right. And that's used to track unfit healthcare practitioners and restrict the ability of incompetent professionals to move from state to state. So, you go from one state to another thinking that they're not going to be able to, find out what you did in your previous state. So that is another way that they have that. All state boards of nursing are mandated to report disciplinary actions, including probation, suspension, and revocation of nursing license to the National Practitioner Data Bank. So again, on Nurses, it'll have your license number, your expiration date. It'll list any disciplinary actions as well. So if you've ever had a complaint to the Board of Nursing that has resulted in disciplinary action, it will be there as well as the letter and what was the disciplinary action. Did you guys hear about the nurse in Florida?
Are you talking about the lady that worked at a hospital and had like 4,000 patients, and then they found out that she just used somebody with the same name, first name as her, and then she claimed she got married and never submitted the license in, the marriage license? Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah,
But
I
I
was
mean,
like, poor Florida.
according to some sources, they said that she had went through nursing school a couple of times. She just didn't pass the boards the first 2 times that she tried. And then
Oh.
when they arrested her, they literally found out that she had passed her boards. She had literally just found out she had passed her boards. So if she had waited like a month for that promotion,
Oh my
she would have been
God.
solid. I mean, granted, I don't recommend doing that at all, but
Right.
it's just crazy that like you literally, if you had waited a week, you would have had your license.
Right.
Like,
Right. Oh, yeah. I saw a couple pieces of it. I was like, I couldn't watch it anymore. I was like, oh, nurses work too hard. We don't need this bad rep.
but people still trust us more than any other profession.
That's true. That is true. All right. So then we get into our legal liability. So we have criminal versus civil action. So a criminal action involves people and society as a whole. And so it's relationships between the government and individuals. So it is unlikely that nurses are involved in criminal action, but these are things like your misdemeanors, your felonies. Felony we know is a serious offense. So that would be like if a nurse injects a client with a lethal drug to hasten death or removes life support, before they've been pronounced dead, that would be a felony. Um, your civil, a civil action is individual versus individual, right? And so when we look at this, it's usually an infringement on somebody's rights, that there is usually some sort of a monetary compensation. And with this, we have we have intentional torts and unintentional torts. So an intentional tort is intended to cause harm to the client, whether it's a threat or even actual harm. Whereas an unintentional tort doesn't mean to harm the client. It's not a defense, right? But it wasn't something done on purpose or intentionally. Um, like not following the 6 rights of medication and or the rights of medication administration, and you inadvertently give the wrong medication, the wrong dose, something along those lines. Then we have liability. So when we look at liability, it's being responsible for something. And so in nursing, liability is associated with civil law, and it includes your contracts, your negligence, your intentional, as well as your unintentional torts. And big thing that we worry about for anybody, right, is going to be negligence. And negligence is the failure to use such care as a reasonably prudent and careful person would use under similar circumstances. And so one of the most common types of negligence is going to be personal injury. So it's, action or lack of action, not what was intended to be done. And so in order to prove negligence on the nurse's part, there are 4 elements that need to be proven. That is your duty, your breach of duty, damages, as well as proximate cause. So duty means that it was the nurse's responsibility to provide care in an acceptable way, right? Based on your education, your policies, your procedures, right? Nurse Practice Act. A breach of duty means that the nurse did not adhere to the nursing standard of care. Whether it was not done, which is an act of omission, or it was not done correctly, which is an act of commission. Okay. A expert nurse witness will be the one to establish the standard of care. Damages means that the client must be able to show that the nurse's negligent act injured them in some way. So they have to be able to prove actual damages. And then your damages, right, in your proximate cause means that there was a reasonable cause and effect relationship between either the act of omission or the act of commission, and the harm to the client, right? So those are what is needed to prove negligence occurred. All right, so the answer's already up there, but we have assault and battery. So I always used to get these mixed up myself, but battery is to cause physical harm to someone, right? You batter them. Assault is a attempt or a threat to hurt someone or to touch someone. So battery is the actual touching of or harming someone, and then assault is the threat. So I'm not going to go to the next slide, but what is an example of a chemical restraint?
Haldol.
You go right for the Haldol. Okay. All right. So yes.
That's their favorite thing to use. The Haldol, Ativan, and Benadryl, boy.
Well, there's a new one I noticed now. What is it? It's shoot, I
Listen,
can't
I saw
remember.
your eyes bug out your head for a second, but I promise you, some of those people that won't even touch them, bro. Not like they'll go through 3 rounds of that, and it's like nothing. Like just still, it's crazy. I swear to God, working on a mental health unit has by far been one of the like funniest experiences of my life because like you
Mhm.
see these teeny tiny people, like my daughter, for instance, she weighs 50 pounds and she's like 4 foot tall. They'll be like that size and you'll give them like 3 or 4 rounds of that night cocktail and nothing. I mean,
Mhm.
nothing.
About 2 weeks ago, no, a week ago, it's been a week. Um, we have a patient that has encephalopathy. He had been living in a group home for the last 40 years. Something happened. He ended up going to the hospital and then he came to us. Um, and usually pretty redirectable. I was counting the cart, we were getting shift change, and he kept grabbing my arm, and I said, please stop grabbing my arm. I will, he really didn't understand. Anyway, long story short, he hauled up and punched me right in the face. I was like, okay, this is going to be a fun night. Um, Unfortunately for him, though, because of his medical history, he's allergic to Haldol. He's allergic to all of those drugs. So his psych drugs are very limited in what they can do. So, and what we can give. So it's very difficult to treat him, but we finally found him a better place that he can, be him and not have to worry about it. But yeah, who was it? Was it Shireen when you said when somebody hits you, you don't hit them back? That was one time I was like, I was taken aback. I have been a nurse for over 25 years. I have never been hit by a patient before. And it takes you, it's a little stunning. I mean, I, kind of just stepped back and I was, in a little bit of pain. But yeah, it takes a lot. But yeah, so your medications or your chemical restraints, right? Your physical restraints would be risk restraints. There's a lot of different types of restraints out there now, or that would be considered restraints, right? Depending on the setting that you're working in long-term care, right? We consider bed rails a restraint. We're not allowed to use bed rails, right? You're not allowed to use jerry loungers anymore either, right? Because they consider those a restraint. So I have to be careful and really
Don't
understand.
even get me started about those Jerry chairs.
Libel and slander. Um, libel is written, slander is verbal. It is a defamation, right? Damage to one character. So some examples of libel would be like sending an email to the editor of a newspaper, posting on social media, whether it's just a message or even adding pictures, false accusations on a performance evaluation would also be an example of libel. All right, so let's say that we had a complaint, whether it was negligence, whether it was malpractice. So the steps for legal actions. All right, so the client believes that the nurse has violated their rights, and the client goes to an attorney or a lawyer, right? Then the attorney is going to have an expert nurse review the client's chart to see whether the client or the nurse has violated the nursing standard of care. Okay, so that's the purpose of that nurse expert review. If it's determined that the standard of care has been violated, that is when the lawsuit is filed, right? Okay, so client says that my rights have been violated. I go to a lawyer. The lawyer is going to have that expert nurse review it and determine if there was a violation of standard of care. Violation of standard of care occurs, that is when the lawsuit is filed. All right, so the client is going to then file a complaint that documents the grievance, and that is then provided to the defendant, which would be the nurse. And then of course the defendant, which was be the nurse, is going to respond. The discovery period, this is all the pretrial stuff, right? So this is where they do statements, they get witnesses, they also have the nurse experts, the client, caregivers, whoever is going to either make statements or going to do interviews. They'll also look at the policy and procedures, right, of the facility that you're working at. And then during the trial, right, this is where everything is presented to the jury, or the judge, depending on where it is. And then they'll come to the verdict. But in these cases, the client, right, the patient has the burden of proof, right, during the trial. So they have to be able to prove and provide the evidence of wrongdoing. And so awards with malpractice is to make the person whole. And it's generally a monetary settlement. An appeal can be made if either the plaintiff or the defendant does not consider the verdict acceptable. All right, so again, they're going to have the violation or the alleged violation, go to a lawyer, they're going to have that expert nurse witness or expert nurse review the chart. And then if they think that there was a standard of care that was violated, that is when they will proceed to the actual case. So everybody has seen, I'm sure, at some point, whether it's in clinicals or even as a a patient or going to visit a patient in a hospital, right? The American Hospital Association developed the Patient Bill of Rights. It is actually renamed now the Patient Care Partnership, Understanding Expectations, Rights, and Responsibilities. This is an ethical, not legal, document for hospitals recommending ways to guarantee clients' rights. And basically, it's just encouraging that client to be a part of their plan of care, right? So they need to collaborate with their providers to, like we tell you guys, right? The patient is the center of that plan of care, right? That care plan. So things like, what should they expect in the hospital, right? That their privacy isn't going to be violated, right? They're going to get good, high quality care, clean, safe environments, that kind of thing. And we've all heard of HIPAA, right? Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And main focus is protection of privacy. That is the main focus of HIPAA. Clients can file a complaint if they think their privacy has been violated. And so it covers all entities HIPAA requires that all covered entities have a privacy officer. So patient comes up to you and says, hey, I think that, my information has been violated or my privacy has been violated, then we are going to direct them to the privacy officer, and the privacy officer will do the investigation to determine if there was a breach of confidentiality. Everybody gets a notice of privacy practices. So it doesn't matter where, right? You go to the doctor's office, you go to the emergency room, you go anywhere, right? They're going to give you a copy of their privacy practices, right? Excuse me. What information can you give out? And so we look at what can we share. So clients have a right to have a copy of their medical records, to review the records upon request. Usually facility has about 30 days in order to provide that information to the client. They can be charged to get a copy of their medical record as well. The nurse will adhere to the minimum necessary rule to protect the client's privacy. So, making sure that we're really careful and not giving a whole lot of information out. This is like, hi, call up to the nurse's station. I'm like, hey, I'm Mrs. Jones' neighbor. I've just called to see how she's doing. Can I give that information? If I'm Mrs. Jones' neighbor, can you give me information about Mrs. Jones? No, right? Unless, you have me listed as like an emergency contact, or Mrs. Jones says I can have that specific information, right? So we do have to be really careful with that. The client's right to consent, right? So we know that, clients have the right to consent or to refuse treatment. That's, their autonomy, right? They have that right to choose. And so, this is making sure that they are fully aware and they are given all that, all the information about what is going on, and so they can make that reasonable decision. So informed consent. Informed consent must be obtained for invasive procedures ordered either for therapeutic or diagnostic purposes. It means that they were told the following in non-medical language. So their diagnosis or suspected diagnosis, right? Maybe we need to do a test to confirm the purpose and the description of the treatment, right? We can send them to a website, or, I think, technology has its place. But, a lot of companies, even surgeons and stuff, have YouTube pages, or they will provide like a link to a video so that they can watch. For example, I had to have cataract surgery. And so when I was going through that process, they literally sent me links to YouTube videos so that I could, get information about the surgery, as well as, kind of see what they were going to do. So that is effective, right? We can make sure that they can, they have the ability to watch those videos, whatever. And then, of course, the surgeons will provide a detailed description. They also need to be told the expected outcomes, the benefits, as well as any side effects or complications that can occur, what alternate therapies or treatments, as well as those benefits, side effects, or complications, the names and qualifications of the people who will perform the procedure. The prognosis of the treatment is not done if it's known. And then answers to any questions, and then explain that the client has the right to revoke permission at any time. So the client must indicate comprehension of the information, right? So they can't just nod their head and say, yeah, I get it, right? They verbally have to say that they understand, maybe ask them to repeat it back, like, what do you know what's going to happen? And so it is the responsibility of the healthcare provider to ensure that informed consent is done. We can, as nurses, we can witness them signing their informed consent. So let's say, for example, you go into a patient's room and the surgeon just left, and you're in there and you ask them to sign that little consent form, and they have further questions. What do? Do you answer the questions?
No, you let the surgeon know that they have additional questions.
Right. You don't let that client sign that paper. You go get the surgeon, right? And have the surgeon come back and reiterate that information. Then we have our end of life. So the Patient Self-Determination Act, that is, just so that they understand what rights they have, governing advanced directives. So the right to participate and direct their own healthcare decisions, whether to accept or refuse medical or surgical treatment, to prepare the advanced directive, and then leaves us with our advanced directives. So there's two different types. We have our living will and we have our durable power of attorney for healthcare. So the living will is a legal document that describes the kind of medical treatments or life-sustaining treatments the person would want if they were seriously or terminally ill. So like there's a lot that can fall under the living will, but like, do they want to have CPR? Do they want to have tests? Do, they want a respirator, tube feeding, right? So hydration. So there's a variety of things that can fall under that living will. It does not specify a person to make healthcare decisions. So this doesn't let the person say, I want my daughter to make my decisions or my spouse or whoever. It's just what they want done should something happen. And it is a legal document in most states in the United States. The durable power of attorney, however, is legal in all 50 states, but names a healthcare proxy. And so that healthcare proxy must be at least 18 years old, and they will make the medical decisions if that person is no longer able to speak for themselves. And so the medical power of attorney is usually a little bit more useful than a living will. And it becomes active anytime the person is unconscious or unable to make a decision. Your do not resuscitate orders. It is an advanced directive based on the Patient Self-Determination Act that gives a physician legal permission to write the order. So we call this a no code, but basically it is a legal order to not resuscitate a client. So if the patient goes into cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, right, we are not going to provide that CPR and that life can't think of the word I was going to say, but we are not going to provide any services. Removal of life support. So the provider, the physician must pronounce the client dead and document that before the nurse turns off the ventilator, right? So we talked about earlier, right? An example of the nurse turning off their ventilator right before they were pronounced. Failure to wait for this determination, right, can be considered an act of murder. It's both illegal as well as unethical. All right, so if we're going to remove life support, the provider has to, right, pronounce them. So other unethical acts that are potentially giving a client a higher prescribed dose of pain medication, accepting bribes, administering CPR to a client with a DNR is actually considered an unethical act. Which then brings us to chapter 17. So chapter 17 was about leading and managing. And so as you know, LPNs, LVNs still need to develop your leadership and your management skills. So this is something that, you will, need to start thinking about now in, how you want to, what type of leader you are going to be. So there's generally 3 different types. You have your autocratic style, your democratic style, and your laissez-faire. So your autocratic are more concerned with tasks. Your democratic are kind of in the middle. They balance concerns with tasks as well as the employee. And then the laissez-faire, they're more concerned with the employee, making sure everybody is happy. It gives away the responsibility to and authority more to the employees. Each one of these has an effective part to play, and most of your leaders will kind of go with a combination of different styles depending on the circumstance, right? Autocratic, they like to bark orders, right? Making sure that every policy is enforced. But think about a crisis situation or a code or an emergency situation, right? That type of leadership would be effective, right? When you need somebody to take control. Democratic is kind of good. It's a nice little balance, right? They encourage employee feedback, are much open with, communication. That laissez-faire, again, employees may be happy, but things may not be getting done appropriately. We have delegation versus assignment. So these are two different terms. What is the difference between delegation and assignment?
Delegation is a transfer of authority, and assignment is like a obligate, like just a regular task for
Right.
that individual.
Very good. Yep. So an assignment is a distribution of work that each staff member is responsible, right, during the given work period. So if you're a CNA, you know what your normal, right, a job is to do when you come to work, right? And then delegation, right? It is the transfer of responsibility for the performance of an activity from one to another, while accountability is retained by the delegator, right? So if I ask my CNA to go get vital signs on, Mrs. Smith, okay, I'm transferring that responsibility for her to, go get the vital signs on Mrs. Smith. However, I am still responsible, right? That to make sure that the vital signs were taken and they were taken appropriately, right?
I
So
have a,
delegation. Oh, go ahead.
sorry.
You're
I have
fine.
a question with that, with delegation, the transfer authority, so I understand that that authority can't be transferred back or transferred to another individual. Are there any exceptions around that, like any case exceptions that we need to watch out for?
No, because if you delegate to someone, right, and because we need to follow those rights of delegation, right? And so if we delegate, we still need to make sure that it was done and it was done appropriately. So here we go. So before you delegate, right, the client, if you're going to delegate, especially to a UAP, right, the client must be stable, right? So before you delegate, the client must be assessed. A CNA or a UAP cannot delegate. Delegation, once accepted, it cannot be transferred. So if I told CNA A to go get vital signs, she can't then turn around and tell CNA B to go get the vital signs. Okay. And once it's delegated, once it's accepted, it can't be transferred. Um, they can refuse, right, the delegation. Generally we want to know why they're refusing that delegation. What's the reasoning behind it? Maybe they don't feel comfortable, they don't understand the skill, they don't know how to perform the skill, or whatever it is that we're asking about them. So, right, so this is where we need to be really careful. And then we always use the nursing process. So we have the rights of delegation. So the 5 rights of delegation: your right task, your right circumstance, the right person, the right directions, and the right communication, as well as the right supervision and evaluation, right? So again, you go and you ask that CNA to go get vital signs, whatever it was, right? You want to make sure you give them the correct directions, what is expected of them. And, of course, you're gonna tell them that you're gonna, bring the vitals back to me, um, within a specific time frame. So you want to be very specific with your delegation. What can we not delegate to our UAPs or nursing assistants? So, or I'm sorry, what we can delegate, to our nursing assistants. So personal care, right? Your hygiene, your dressing, your toileting, grooming, skincare, feeding and hydration, basic restorative skills. So transferring, positioning, ambulating, range of motion, vital signs, height, weights, INOs, assistance with elimination, when they can do Foley care as well, making sure that they are and maintaining those safety factors, again, bed and lowest position, sunrails up, um, infection prevention, that's a big one, right? Making sure that the lines are not on the floor, um, washing their hands. They can also do application of heat and cold. They can also collect urine and stool specimens. Again, you want to make sure that you're providing correct, um, directions and how that should be done. Things that we do not want to delegate to our UAPs. Sterile technique procedures. Nursing assistants don't have training in sterile technique. So anything type of sterile technique, we are not going to delegate. Crisis situations, right? Resident all of a sudden develops chest pain. That is not someone that we are going to, right, give to our UAPs, right? That's where the nurse needs to step in. They've also not been trained to make decisions about or interpret data. Okay, so they take a glucose level, they take a blood pressure, and it's abnormally high. They can't determine if it needs to be rechecked. So the goal there is for them to return back to you to give them, give you the results that they have obtained. And then you as the nurse are going to determine, right, or interpret that data. You can also not delegate any duties that are not part of your legal scope of practice. All right, so as nurses, not only do you have to know your scope of practice within your state you're practicing in, but you also have to know the scope of practice of those that work with you and for you. So like your CNAs, you'll have to know what their scope of practice is, as well as what policies and, procedures that the hospital has enforced. So for like, I'm just going to use an example. So in a long-term care facility, correct, a CNA may be able to get vital signs. They can do all the traditional CNA personal care, the restorative care, right, all of that. But CNAs can't do glucose level. They usually won't do glucose levels or glucose checks. Whereas in a hospital setting, right, a CNA can get additional training as a whatever they call them where you are, like a patient care technician, where, right, some of them do start IVs, some of them draw blood, right? They do glucose checks, they do vital signs, right? So that's a different scope of practice. So that's why it's very important for you to know, your nurse practice at what they can and cannot do, as well as what the hospital says they can, or the organization says that they can and cannot do. Change of shift report. So SBAR is usually, right, the best way to do your change of shift report. It's a baseline report. It's, just, it's, it's not, sometimes it's a little more in depth than others. but it's just a quick overview of each of your residents to compare the status with the status reported at change of shift, right? And so again, consider the scope of practice that you're giving report to. So if you're LPN reporting to an RN or an RN reporting to an LPN, right, you want to consider who you're giving the information to. And then the last little bit is what can you do to increase your employment opportunities? So again, there's certifications that are available, whether it's your IV certification, long-term care certification, yours, wound care, attending seminars, taking leadership courses, in-service programs, books, articles, networking is also a key aspect here. The more people that you know, even in different departments, right? Networking will help to maybe get your foot into the door somewhere where you want to work, right? That you haven't been able to get into, so proving yourself. And remember too, when you're out in your clinicals, and I know you're getting close to the end of your program, right? But those are like little mini job interviews, right? Those nurses, the supervisors, the managers on those units are looking at you as nursing students, as potential employees. I know when I was on campus, I would have students come back all the time, towards the end and be like, yeah, they want me to go work when I graduate, right? So this is, your time to shine and really show them what you're made of. All right, sorry I went over a little bit. Does anybody have any questions for me? No? All right, guys. Well, I will see some of you tomorrow. Thank you for coming and good luck.
Thank
Have
you
a
so
great night.
much.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. You're welcome.